Welcome everyone. We'll give people 1 or 2 minutes just to trickle in. Lovely to see some people who joined us for the first session. Lovely to see some new people, new old people. Lovely. Welcome everyone. We'll give people 1 more minute to find their way from the lobby to the Zoom room. Okay, friends. Welcome to our participants. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to all. It's really wonderful to bring us together and to convene this second session of our Spiritual Ecologies conference. This day is an opportunity for us to be thinking together and to reflect upon how the combined or inter-included themes of education and theology and activism and contemplation can inform the many faces of our contemporary environmental work. As I noted in our first session, I'll just say it again now, this day is very much an offering in honor of the memory of Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, my friend and teacher, and really the teacher of countless individuals and generations of Jewish environmentalists who passed away quite suddenly some 2 months ago. I'm still very much within the feeling of that loss, and I'm not alone in that. I will not reiterate here or otherwise the many and wonderful tributes to her life and work that have been published in the wake of her death, but I would just say that she was a gifted author, an inspiring educator, and a tireless advocate for infusing the work of ecology with a religious dimension. Ellen understood so well that the climate crisis is a spiritual crisis that must be addressed by nurturing and inspiring human responsibility that's grounded in appreciating beauty, interconnection, and intimacy with the world around us. Ellen was also a longtime friend and collaborator with the Institute of Jewish Spirituality and Society, the sponsor of today's events, and where I have the honor of serving as the senior scholar in residence. Here at the IJSS, our mission is to advance scholarship in social transformation bringing Jewish spiritual knowledge to bear on the toughest challenges of contemporary society. We aim to break down the barriers between spheres of knowledge and practice, enabling long-term collaboration of scholars, social researchers, and human services practitioners. This, our second session, highlights the power of contemplative ecology, examining how the practices of coming to attention can help us build spiritual sensitivity to see the world with new eyes and to stretch our moral imagination. Here, as in the first session, we will have three speakers, three presenters, who will give us fodder for thinking, each one about 15 minutes. We will then have the opportunity to engage them in conversation, and they will engage each other in conversation after that. The Q&A is live. Feel free to ping us if you have questions. And without further ado, I think I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and I will come in to introduce everyone in order. It's my great honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Douglas Christie, who received his undergraduate degree from UC Santa Cruz, an MA from Oxford, and his PhD from the Graduate Theological Union here in Berkeley. Douglas has been awarded fellowships from many different foundations. He's the author of three extraordinary and wonderful books: The Word in the Desert, Scripture in the Quest for Holiness in Early Christian Monasticism, The Blue Sapphire of the Mind, Notes for a Contemplative Ecology, and most recently, The Insurmountable Darkness of Love, Mysticism, Loss, and the Common Life. Without further ado, Douglas, I'm going to hand the floor over to you, and thank you so much for coming to share your wisdom with us today.
Thanks, Ariel. It's really a delight for me to be here. I want to say a word of thanks to Ariel for pulling this together. I really appreciate your generosity of spirit in honor of your teacher and friend and mentor. I also want to express my own gratitude to Ellen Bernstein. It was probably 20 years ago that I encountered a very short article of hers in which she was beginning to work out some of her own thinking about ecology and spirituality. And it came to me at a time when I was just beginning to think about these things for myself. And it was kind of a bolt out of the blue for me. I really remember so strongly the impact it had on me. And it stayed with me ever since. So I really feel so grateful to be here today, honoring her. And I just wanted to acknowledge that debt. Um, so what I'd like to do today is uh, speak in personal terms about um, my own orientation to this subject. And I'm going to frame that around my lifelong and ever deepening feeling for the desert, and the desert as a vibrant landscape that calls for our attention on its own terms, and the desert as a contemplative space. I don't think those are in any way contradictory. I think they move together, but over time, I've come to see them as more integrated. So, just to begin, to say this is where I come from, the Pacific Northwest, Mount Rainier, or Tahoma, as it was called by the indigenous peoples, looms over the entire Pacific Northwest landscape. It appears and disappears behind clouds. People who grow up in the Pacific Northwest are known to exclaim when the clouds lift, the mountain is out. And so we all grew up with a feeling of this incredible presence. So I did not grow up in a desert. I grew up in a place where it rained all the time, where it was constantly overcast, where you could start growing fungus between your toes if you weren't careful. And this is where I also grew to love the world, although it took me some time to come back to this love of this place. And this is where I've ended up, more or less. Um, this is the Eastern Mojave Desert, the Granite Mountains. That's the Providence Mountains in the distance. Um, I live in Los Angeles, and over the last 25 years, the Mojave Desert has become like a second home for me. And it's a little unexpected, to say the least, to come from that landscape in the Pacific Northwest and then find myself falling head over heels for the desert. But it happened, and it's taken hold of me, and now it's become central to my thinking about contemplative ecology and the work that we all share in. And my path to the desert came in no small part through another non-desert place, this uh, community in the redwood forest of Northern California, Redwoods Monastery. Um, I first made my way there in the late 1970s, and it was my first introduction to the tradition of contemplative practice as it emerged from the fourth century Egyptian desert and carried on all the way across the centuries into our own time. A community of Cistercian nuns, originally from Belgium. Um, they invited me into their midst, and it was here that I first experienced what it meant to enter silence in an intentional way with a community of fellow seekers. I also noticed, and you'll notice from this image, that um, this chapel and the entire monastic space reflects a feeling for being in a place that is organic and whole and encompassing. The altar is central for the liturgical life of the community and for prayer. Behind the altar is a large glass window. Behind that, a redwood tree branches up into four different trunks in different directions. Behind that, the meadow. Behind that, the forest and Thompson Creek, which runs to the Pacific Ocean. So in this space, I think is where I first began to apprehend the feeling that there was really no division between the inner and the outer landscapes. And this community embodied it and brought me into an awareness of this. And it really changed me and is still forming me to this day. And my encounter with the nuns at Redwoods eventually led me to Egypt, to the far eastern desert in Egypt, which is in monastic circles anyway, famous because it's where the monk Anthony eventually found himself after traveling 3 days and 3 nights from the Nile Valley out into this very remote part of the eastern desert. This was in the fourth century. This is when uh, Christian monasticism was just beginning to become an idea. And Anthony, because his story was told so eloquently in the narrative, the life of Anthony by Athanasius, became renowned in the ancient Christian world. And there's a note in the life of Anthony that's almost unprecedented in early Christian literature, as far as I'm aware, and that is this note of love for place. Anthony travels across the desert, uh, arrives at this place on the Galala Plateau, beholds before him the mountains, palm trees, finds a small spring there. And the narrative says he immediately fell in love with the place. He immediately fell in love with the place. And it's so striking to feel that note of love of place right at the heart of the ancient Christian monastic tradition. And I later learned that the Cistercian tradition, anyway, monks are often known simply as lovers of the place. So here again is the contemplative tradition connected deeply to place and to love of place. And this too made a big impression on me in my thinking. Um, I'll just say a couple more things here by way of context, and that is if you proceed along the way in this tradition, as I've done in my reading and thinking, and find yourself among the late medieval mystics like Meister Eckhart, Hadovich of Antwerp, and John Ruysbroek, you find this kind of astounding language in which the mystery of God becomes imagined as a kind of desert. It is a weird paradox. It's part of the apophatic tradition. God is beyond anything we can imagine or say or conceive. And so this language of desert and abyss and darkness and void starts to come into play because nothing else will quite do to convey the sense of ultimate mystery of who God is in our experience. And Rusbrook takes it a step further and remarks in one of his treatises, it's not only that God is a desert, but that we ourselves are a desert. And this is why we feel such a kindred sense of belonging in relation to the divine. And one other comment here briefly, Meister Eckhart, he reminds his hearers, usually they were young Dominicans in his care, that there is the work of acquiring an inward desert, something we are invited to work at and open ourselves to and in flesh in our own being. And this is something quite remarkable and beautiful in this tradition, that the desert becomes an inner possession of our own beings. So all of this led me back to my new home in California, the Owens Valley. And I'm just going to finish here with a few images of these places because even though part of this tradition wants to invite us beyond images and beyond language, paradoxically, we're always invited back into a full and vibrant love for the world, for reality. And this happened to me not only because of my own time spent in these places, but also because of the work of gifted teachers like Mary Austin and others who helped me see what I had previously been incapable of seeing. The Owens Valley being a place where the desert meets the Great Sierra Madres. It's an ecotone space, beautiful, vibrant. It's been degraded, but it's starting to recover its vibrancy. And this too has become part of my extended home, the Eastern Mojave, the Granite Mountains, the Kelso Dunes, a place where I often take students. Sometimes I go by myself, sometimes I bring my children, my spouse. It's a place that's become a place of my heart and also a place that I think I've come to understand as central to any kind of work of healing that those in my circle are hoping to embark upon, retreating into this space, feeling the depth of the silence, renewing our own love for the world, and then returning nourished and renewed to do the good work that we're called to do. And that also applies to other deserts. You don't have to be a desert wanderer to become a person of the desert. Um, this is the desert, high desert of the Altiplano in Argentina, but you begin to notice uh, that love of the world through any landscape becomes infectious. And if you love one place, you begin to realize that your capacity to love other places is deepened and enhanced. The flamencos, an endangered species, thriving at 14,000 feet in the high desert of Argentina. And so this returns me to my teachers at Redwoods, who brought me into an awareness that to enter the silence is necessary for every one of us to open ourselves to the deepest thing in us and the deepest thing in the world. And it's utterly solitary, and paradoxically, it connects us to others. Solitude and community move together. And that's what I want to end on, which is just a note of solidarity and accompaniment. This is another desert place I visited some years ago in the Philippines, in Manila, one of the most densely packed cities of the world. And the followers of Charles de Foucault, Little Sisters of Jesus, invited me into their space. Very, very poor, uh, really just unbelievably challenging living conditions for those whom they were accompanying. And this was their desert work, to be in this place, to live in accompaniment with others, and to open their hearts to that reality that we all share. And so this also is part of my ongoing learning about what it means to enter the desert. So this finally, and in ecological terms, I'll just end here, is just something I think has become more and more important to my own language. This monastic tradition speaks often of something they just refer to as the common life, the life we all share together, humans, those in the more than human world, all of us all together. So cultivating the common life is our most important contemplative task, I think. Something I've come to feel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Douglas, for that stirring invitation to consider place inside, outside, the relationship between language and affability, between fullness and darkness, and the way that we walk and retreat and go inwards to go outwards. Um, so many questions, so much to continue, but I will suffice myself with those brief remarks, and then we'll have a much fuller conversation in just a few moments. It's now a great delight to introduce my friend and colleague, Simone Kotva, research fellow at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Oslo, where she works on ecology and religion. Simone has just completed a book on contemplation and nature in Christian mysticism entitled Ecologies of Ecstasy, Mysticism, Philosophy, and Vegetal Life. In her first book, Effort and Grace on the Spiritual Exercise of Philosophy, is a tour de force of erudition and asking the deepest of all questions. Simone, thank you.
Thank you so much for those words, Ariel, and thank you again for this invitation and the chance to honor Ellen Bernstein's work. I always came across it with like a lot of reverence and feeling very far away from it geographically. And so this is a way for me also to somehow come closer to it. I wanted to talk also, maybe perhaps in the spirit of Douglas before me, and on a personal note about contemplation. And I thought I would tell you about how contemplation in my own practice as a kind of scholar practitioner, as I write on contemplation, but I also practice it, how contemplation became ecological for me, and how contemplating in what began in a kind of purely mystical context then became something that allowed me to understand my thoughts about ecology and environmentalism, and to live that more fully and to sort of activate it. And it began a number of years ago when I started to become curious about the Christian mysticism that I had studied at university, and then started researching, and I wanted to try contemplative prayer. And so I found a manual that I really liked from the 17th century, and I started working from it mostly. And I didn't really have ecology in mind when I was doing it. I had already started to become interested in environmentalism, but this was more to sort of satisfy my own curiosity about spiritual exercises and mysticism. And I didn't really have much of a background in contemplative prayer, to be honest. I'm raised Catholic, so I had some exposure to the rosary and other things that you can do as a Catholic when it comes to prayer life. But I'd never tried anything like contemplative prayer. And it asks you to do something very strange, which is this letting go of everything, of words, of concepts, and just letting this love for God enter you and fill you up, kind of set you on fire with love for God. And when I began doing this, it was hard, and I failed pretty miserably first time I tried, and ended up becoming very anxious by the whole effort. Felt very effortful. It didn't feel like I was really doing any of the things that the text said I was supposed to be doing. So, feeling more centered and open to the divine presence. It mostly just felt like I was sort of forcing myself to do something ascetic. And sometimes I felt good about it in that kind of smug way that you can do when you're doing spiritual exercises. But so I had to actually let it go after a while, because it was kind of ruining my mental health, to be honest. And then I continued with other projects, and suddenly there was this one day when I was able to pick it all up again. And I remember sitting down to that session, doing the kind of prayer that you do in the contemplative tradition, which is just to sit down and kind of take a breath and just open yourself to the divine in this silent interior dialogue. And I had, I guess, arrived at some place in my life where I was able to just do that without any thought about where it might lead me, or what I might be getting out of it, or how it was supposed to feel, or why I was doing this, or what the text said. I actually just, in the end, followed what the text said, which is, don't think about theology, don't think about anything you've ever read, just open yourself. So I did. And suddenly this practice started to live for me. And strange things started to happen to my body. I became kind of very sensitive to environments. I started to feel this overwhelming sense of the elements around me. But more than that, I guess it was a feeling of becoming aware in a visceral way of how the world isn't separate from me and my body, but actually just kind of presses in a very delightful way, accompanied by a sense of contiguity with the world, as if there wasn't really this difference between me and it. And these sensations grew in intensity, and I started seeing them when I went back to my text, that they were actually described there as the enjoyment and the pleasure that you get from contemplation, and as the kind of response of God to you. And then I started to leave my room and do this exercise and practice more outside. And I found that the response, as it were, that I'd interpreted, and perhaps it was, of God, actually was amplified when I was outside with trees, for instance, especially plants. I mean, there are not many wild animals where I live, in a semi-urban area in Scandinavia. And there are a lot of trees and plants. So it was amplified by natural environments. And I also started feeling that there were kind of resonances between my own state when I was in contemplation, and how, for instance, plants and trees especially were present to me. It's very difficult to explain more than that, but I felt myself becoming a bit plant-like. And I didn't really know what to do about this feeling for a long time. And I didn't really see very much evidence of anyone having similar conclusions about contemplation in the literature. And so I was at a loss for a while, but then I started to notice that, in fact, a lot of the ancient sources, not just in Christianity, but actually also in Jewish Hellenistic philosophy, did talk about contemplation as a natural activity, as a life according to nature. And when we read that in translation, a natural activity, living according to nature, it does sound rather abstract. I think I had always kind of glossed over it, thinking, oh, that just means that you kind of live according to your created being or something. And then I started instead reading it more literally in the Greek sense of living according to nature is living physically, living as the growing world of emerging things, which is sort of what physis means in Greek. It's the world of growth and becoming. And then I thought that perhaps contemplation isn't this thing that we do in order to reach beyond ourselves, and it's perhaps a way of attuning to the natural rhythms and ways of life that are sustained in our bodies and by our bodies, and that we share with other things around us that are sustained similarly by these very subtle but important rhythms. And so that's how contemplation for me became ecological. And it was a way for me to then actually reread the contemplative tradition, my tradition, which is Christianity, and see these patterns emerge of a kind of hidden contemplation, a contemplation that is not talked about a lot. And I don't think there's a lot of awareness of it anymore. But it's there in so many different places, and also in, of course, Ellen's work when it comes to the Song of Songs and this importance of the garden, for instance, not just as something that you look at theologically and contemplate, but you are actually living like as a garden yourself. And in the Christian tradition, there are these ideas of placing the garden in your heart, of actually experiencing yourself as the garden of the Song of Songs. Those sorts of images I felt spoke very much to my own experience. And my conclusion from all this, because I think we're coming to the close of my minutes, is that I don't think this idea of living according to nature and contemplating in a natural way is a metaphor. I think it's actually very literal. And I think that a lot of the metaphors we have about contemplation when it comes to ecology, there's so many comparisons between the soul and a flower, for instance. God is the sun, you're like a plant turning towards it. All these sorts of images that are so striking, I think they are living symbols. And I think they're based on the experience of contemplatives, choosing images that, yes, are figurative, of course, but also speak to a kind of epiphany about their own bodies that they experience through contemplation. So yeah, that's what I wanted to offer, just a little image of how the practice has informed research and how contemplation became ecological and then sort of went all full circle. I hope I haven't spoken for too long. Thank you.
That's ideal in every way, Simone. Thank you so much. We've spoken of place, we've spoken of plant, we've spoken of living images, porosity. This is going to be a wonderful conversation, and you've pushed the boat out in exactly the right way. Thank you so much. It's my great joy to introduce the third panelist, also a friend, also a colleague, Devin Zuckerman, who is the postdoctoral researcher at the University of Virginia's Contemplative Sciences Center, having recently and triumphantly just completed her PhD in religious studies. Devin's research explores Himalayan Buddhist philosophies of materiality, the human body, the senses, the environment, and the convergence of these themes in Buddhist practices of meditation. Devin, thank you.
Thanks so much, Ariel. And thanks so much to my fellow panelists. It's such an honor, first of all, to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak in honor of your teacher and teacher to many of us here, Ellen Bernstein. So thank you. And also so wonderful to be gathering with this panelist of colleagues who I've had the pleasure of working with in other ways. And so I just celebrate our ongoing opportunities to collaborate. I want to begin by posing a question to this group because it's a question that I've been thinking about lately for myself as it pertains to my research on Buddhist contemplative literature from the 12th century. Namely, the question of when did I find out about the environment? And what I mean by that is, when did I learn about the environment as a kind of moral entity, as something that in its precarity requires kinds of human protection? where that protection manifests, especially as kinds of conservation, sustainability, like practically speaking, recycling and so on, as something independent of or in connection with, but different from land, water, and air, or the outdoors, or just outside. Because I don't think it was actually until I was closer to being an adult, a young adult, that I knew about the environment, so to speak. And that's because of, I think, the circumstances, the sort of perhaps unique circumstances and privileges of my own upbringing, namely that I grew up with access to a lot of natural spaces and connection to non-human others, because I grew up in the country. I grew up in a part of Western Virginia, not West Virginia. For anyone for whom that's I might be the only one in this room for whom that's an important distinction, but I grew up in the country where there was a lot of land, water, plants, animals, animal husbandry, agriculture, and so forth, but not a lot of like environmentalism, not a lot of kind of recreating, in nature, like camping and hiking and so on, which is actually ironic because I grew up, like quite literally the home that I grew up in is closer in driving distance to like trailheads of the Appalachian Trail, this like sort of famous, hiking trail in the American, the like East Coast of the United States, closer to the Appalachian Trail than to like a grocery store, for instance. And really wasn't until I was a little bit older that I had a sense of like recreating, like hiking as a sort of recreational activity that's in some way connected to this like abstract entity, the environment, right? So anyway, the point is that I have these really rich sensory memories of the natural world, of like wild plants and like wild edible plants, and planting some of our own food, and streams and quarries, and fishing, and animal births and animal deaths, right? Not just these sort of pleasant sensory memories, but also quite evocative, like difficult memories of death and decay and nature and so on. So that's also my question for others. When did you learn about the environment? Was it before or after you had an experience of those things that we, I think, sometimes only secondarily think of as land, water, air, animal, plant, and so on? And what changes, if anything, when you experience land, water, and air as the material basis of this moral entity known as the environment? What changes, if anything, when we understand those things together or apart, right? And I'm curious about this because my own research deals with histories of contemplative practices in a Tibetan Buddhist tradition that's known as the Great Perfection, or Dzogchen. And I work on these old contemplative practices that have only a kind of marginal living tradition of practice presently. And I mention that because people can sometimes forget that indigenous cultural practices exist in the present, right? And in this case, the practices that I study do exist in the present, but very marginally, and they sort of reached the height of their popularity in the 12th century. So these practices involve training on sensory experiences of the primary elements, earth, water, fire, and air, or earth, water, fire, and wind, in the natural environment. And mostly these practices involve sounds. So listening to the sound of water or wind, but also training in the visual perceptions of flames in the fire, or kinesthetic experiences of the kinds of textures of the earth. So there's this whole kind of deep multisensory experience of engaging the senses in nature. There has been so much emphasis, I feel, on how environmental meditation practices, especially, let's say, for my purposes, those from Buddhist traditions in the global South, can improve the moral subjectivities of, let's say, wealthy white people in the global North vis-a-vis caring for the environment, or more accurately, according to kinds of like Western liberal environmental ethical values like sustainability. There's a lot of conversation about how meditation can improve these things, right? Or in many cases, how meditation practices can improve health, right? In the case of environmental contemplative practices, how to ameliorate the suffering of eco-anxiety or environmental anxiety in the face of climate change. And of course, I don't think that that's a bad thing. I especially take seriously and honor that eco-anxiety is real and deeply felt, and a very disturbing experience it is for my students that I have in the classroom, and it definitely has been for me. And our systems of care, at least again in the United States, I'll speak for myself, are not sufficient to meet these needs, among other deficiencies that are creating the problems of climate change in the first place, right? So I guess I wonder, and this is really the point, what we miss when we presume or when we project a kind of like environmentalist view, or a capital or Anthropocene or capitalocene or plantationocene vision of the world onto contemplative practices or environmental epistemologies and other kinds of wisdom practices where there is no Anthropocene. When we project the kind of moral entity of the environment back into land, water, and air, or we sort of fail to separate them, it's a kind of, it can be, I think, a kind of orthodoxy, and I think it can be problematic when you think about the power relationships involved, like when we're talking about Buddhist contemplative practices in the Himalayas and how people might want to use some of these practices to like transform their own like sort of sense of moral responsibility to the environment. Who benefits from that, and who doesn't benefit from that, right? So these kinds of questions, I think, can come into play importantly in some of these considerations. But also, I think maybe perhaps more importantly to the point I want to make today, we miss something important, I think, when we sort of when we overlook the material things in service of this more abstract reality. What actually happens in the immediacy of our sensory experiences with the natural world? Or what happens, for instance, when we take seriously the ethical stakes that are proposed by the traditions without sort of pressing them into the service of our own kind of urgent needs in this present moment? For instance, in the 4 sounds of the elements practices, and this is one of the more kind of fascinating details of these practices for me at least, is that by meditating on sounds in the environment, these texts describe these kinds of supersensory experiences that emerge. Experiences of hearing the voices of, let's say, more than human others. For instance, in the sounds of water, the practitioners hear the voices of the Dakini, these kind of divine beings who are intimately connected with in many ways with the transmission of Buddhist Dharma, as they say in Tibet. But you also hear in the sounds of earth the voices of all beings in the universe, according to the Buddhist kind of cosmological system of the 6 realms. So you hear beings that are in the hell realms, you hear ghosts that are sort of the unseen beings of the land. You hear the voices of animals, and you actually begin to hear the inner thoughts of human beings as well, and in particular their forms of suffering, with the condition of suffering of all beings sort of being said to is the sort of fundamental, the desire to rescue all beings from this foundational kind of suffering is the sort of foremost ethical tenet of Buddhism. So this awareness is only kind of secondary to the real purpose of these practices, which is, of course, to become a Buddha and become enlightened, and thereby be capable of rescuing all of these beings from this like particular form of suffering that becomes evident in the practice. So to see this as a kind of environmental ethical practice, I think troubles, for some of us, maybe it's sort of like very evident how this functions as an environmental ethical practice, but I think in some ways it sort of troubles some dearly held beliefs about both of these terms, environmental and ethical. In the first place, because it entails that the environment extends even further outward beyond the scale of the visible material world to include cosmological entities that are understood to shape our existence. In the second place, it's ethical according to this very kind of strictly Buddhist sense of the ethical goal of attaining enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. It doesn't claim to ease eco-anxiety, to improve a sense of ecological belonging. After all, belonging in a kind of cosmic ecology is taken as given. Practitioners are already aware. They know that they exist within a Buddhist cosmos consisting of the 6 realms. It's not like it's being confirmed for them. It's just they're experiencing it in a new way. It doesn't motivate one to act to save or protect the material and natural formations that are the objects of meditation, but rather to rescue these unseen others for whom the elements, the material elements, are really just a medium of connection, right? So there's definitely more that can be said, sort of unpacking how these practices exist within very kind of cultural and religious specificity as ethical practices, motivating kinds of ethical actions and moral formation within the sort of specific context of Buddhism, right? But I think a more relevant question for us today regarding these practices as multi-faith scholars and practitioners representing diverse contemplative traditions is something like, is it enough just to be with the world in the ways that these practices advise? In other words, merely to attend to the immediacy of our senses or the immediacy of our experiences, the sights and sounds and smells of the world, is it its own kind of ethical act? Can it be its own kind of ethical act, sort of independent of the expectation that it will transform me into a better something, into a better environmental activist or something like that? And I think the answer is yes, or I think it can be. And this is why it helps me to sort of think back to a time before I knew about the environment. In those kinds of recollections are evidence, I think, and I actually think being a child also has a lot to do with it for me personally, that there's something subversive in our very fast and extractive world about simply being with our experience, especially in a moment in the world in which our attention and our awareness has been rendered quite literally in terms of market value, right? Where companies vie for our attention, the same companies who have the power to literally end deforestation, carbon dependence, all of these things, right? To take our attention back, to give our attention to the world is actually very subversive and flies in the face of powers that oppress and destroy and which feel so unassailable. Much in the way I think that the Buddha taught contemplation as a way of overcoming the seemingly unassailable powers of old age, sickness, and death. The powers that we face today are indeed great, but surely no greater than old age, sickness, and death. So with that, I'll end with a lot of gratitude for the chance to be with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devin. So, place, plants, and the practices of the elements. What a lovely point of departure for the next 45 minutes in our conversation. Um, Devin, speaking personally, and the question that you asked about the environment, I feel like I never learned about it. And I'm constantly being told that there's this thing called nature or the environment or this vacillation back and forth. And yet, my earliest memories, which really stretch into the present, are one in which my sort of axiomatic or fundamental posture is one of porosity and one of interconnectedness. Um, for me, as much as place and as much as plant and as much as element, it's really about the animals and this kind of um, almost like soulful biophilia that I have felt from my earliest days has really did so much of my life. I remember as a child, um, setting up the chairs in my living room so that they were a reef and I could be a shark and I would just swim around in this. And I wouldn't do it for like 10 minutes. This was like hours and hours and days upon days. And, when I think back on that, I'm like, that's very much kind of how I see the world still. Like, one of my children got into one of his like earliest moments of conflict was someone who told him, "You can't be a bird when you grow up." And he was like, "Well, what do you mean I can't be a bird?" And you could just see in his mind, like, well, the dinosaurs grew up to be birds. Why can't I be birds? Like, why can't I do that? What is this thing that you're telling me is this stark dichotomy in between my form of life and my form of being? and these other things that surround me and co-create me and are co-constituent with me. And I think I've spent the last 20 years of my life studying Hasidism, this form of Jewish mysticism, which really has no interest in um, in any kind of hard dichotomies, whether those are between self and other, or inner and outer, or even this last question that you broached, Devin, of the contemplative moment and activism. These this this exists within almost like a continuum of experience, or a shuttling back and forth in the Hasidic imagination, such that our activism in the world and our activism in our inner world, or our action in the world and our inner co-creation of that, are so firmly intertwined that, as it's so often said, the road to the divine leads through the heart of the human being in front of you. And obviously, in our context, that would mean the more than human also. Lovely. So here I'll invite questions from all of our friends and fellow travelers. I won't say that they're in the audience because they're here with us, even though the webinar format's a little bit odd for that. But I'll also open it up to Douglas and Simone, and if you want to take up the challenge of the questions that Devin has put forward, or enter into conversation with one another.
Just a note of etiquette. How should we behave with our microphones, um, Ariel?
I,
Just
you
on
know,
and off when we're speaking and so forth? Yes.
I guess so, but I think we can run things in a fairly informal way, and also, we're in constant conversation, and I hope that
Yeah.
that's what we
Yeah.
do here.
Well, just one note. I would just, Devin, thank you so much. And Simone, gosh, just so beautiful what you presented. And I mean, kind of, you mentioned the subversive character of this work, Devin. I would say the same about what Simone presented. Is there anything more hidden and more elusive to our consciousness than our vegetal life? And you're asking us to consider something else, also often hidden or undervalued, um, that might be the most important work of all. So I appreciate the work and the thought that's gone into each of your research projects. And I can't help but notice that in some ways you're inviting us into the space of the minuscule and the hidden and the secret. And I love that. And I know there's more to say about that regarding where that might take us, or how that fits into a larger shared work that we're all engaged in. But I love that you invoked that. And I just want to say thank you for that. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on the question, or one of the questions that you posed, Devin. I love the question. I also really like this idea of actually choosing where to direct attention is very subversive. That's certainly how I feel contemplation works. You asked something that I loved, which was, can it be an ethical act? And how is it ethical? And I think that we throw the term ethics around a lot. I mean, I know that I sometimes do with students as well, because it's a sort of easy way into things. But I'm not sure we always know what we mean by ethics. And of course, it depends on like how you define it. But one way of defining it recently that I've been thinking with, which has been very fruitful, is quite literally to do with fruits. And it's the idea that you find in Greek philosophy that ethics is about the habits that contribute to thriving, flourishing, right? Depending on how you translate. And that the good isn't a thing kind of beyond the world necessarily, but that which allows for our thriving. So if something's good for you, it allows for your thriving. And obviously thriving is never understood separate from an ecosystem of other things thriving as well, right? So there's like thriving is always co-thriving. And it strikes me that like the way I think we're all talking about contemplative traditions and practices is that they do encourage your personal thriving in a way that is also co-thriving, right? And so like if we think about ethics in that way, I think it can be useful and take ethics out of a kind of abstract realm that it exists in a lot of spaces that I frequent through my research, from a funded research project at the university, which is environmental humanities, and these terrible concepts like ecosystem services and just like the worst kind of language around ethics. So yeah, that was just a thought about ethics and thriving.
So interesting, Simone. Thank you for sharing that.
We have in the Q&A a wonderful question from Chris Chappell. Devin, can you describe a moment of reorientation through Buddhist meditation? Simone, can you please speak a bit about the techniques of contemplative prayer? Does it entail words, breath? And Douglas, can you describe a place of great discovery in the Owens Valley?
I wonder what Chris means by moment, like describe a moment of reorientation through Buddhist meditation. Do you want to say more, Chris? And I can let the other folks answer, unless maybe perhaps they have more questions for you as well.
Yeah, Devin, I just sort of invite you to use that open space to reflect on a moment in your own practice where things shifted.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So, I mean, speaking to, as Simone mentioned already, that there is a kind of, there's a kind of scholar practitioner practice. There's my sort of Buddhist contemplative practice, and then there's also some other kind of marginal third space of my practice as a scholar practitioner, as someone who is studying contemplative practice, kind of very seriously, from a kind of more scholarly perspective. And I will say that I spend a lot of time reading these texts, which are so like reading and trying to make sense of these texts, which are so literally esoteric. I mean, they're esoteric in nature, and they are from the 12th century, and some of them even earlier, and they presume the presence of like a teacher who is well trained and deeply knowledgeable about these practices, kind of offering like kind of oral instruction, like the texts are read with someone. And I've done quite a bit of that, but also because they're so old and for other reasons that have to do with like provenance and all of this stuff that I won't get into today, they're hard to understand even with that kind of support. So anyway, I spend a lot of time, like there's a lot of space for me to think about the meanings of these texts, and there's a lot of descriptions of the elements, to the point where like I really have, I think, started to, and this gets into this question about reorientation, is like I've gotten into a rhythm of like seeing the elements not only as material objects that I experience in nature, but as like categories that organize the entire universe of meaning, right? They're not just like units of matter, although they are, but they're also like an organizing principle of the universe, including like how we organize like how we organize thoughts, right? How we organize the world of meaning, I think, is a good way to put it. And I think that actually is begun to transform my perception and my experience of the material reality of the world that's also elemental in nature. And it's subtle things like I think that I am starting to feel, or at least I'm like opening up to a new experience of time in the elements. Time as something slower than like kind of analog time, like time on a clock, you know? Um, and those aren't really experiences of Buddhist contemplation that are necessarily prescribed by the tradition in the most kind of foundational sense of my Buddhist training. But there are different places in the text where they describe things like a sixth sense of time in the elements. So there's something happening with that, I think. And I think maybe people who have like a lot of like real genuine like wisdom and practice, you know, experience can speak to that better than I can, but something is starting to happen there. So I'll just share that.
Thank you.
Was the next one was for me, I think. Can you hear me better now? There was some problem with hearing my upper range. Okay. I hope this is better. I'm going to talk about the techniques of contemplation that I could talk about for just hours, even though they're very simple. But I wanted to pick up on, Devin, what you were saying about elemental practice, because it exists also in other traditions, and I've been doing one, and it has a similar kind of results, and it really is amazing. Like there was one, I was doing a water practice, and then I went out and walked the same route that I always walk to the bus stop, and it goes past a stream that makes a sound, like it's a kind of cascading stream, right? And I suddenly stopped and completely froze because it was like I could hear voices. And it wasn't like suddenly the stream was talking to me personally, but it was like I could hear them as a discourse. Really, really wild experience, actually. And it was because I had just been doing contemplative practice and with the water. And then I came and I walked past this noise, and I could hear it in a different way. And it was astonishing. It was very much like what you described, where, you know, I mean, I could interpret that as being the water spirits speaking to me and so on, or having a conversation in Parliament or whatever. Anyway, but the techniques of contemplative prayer, I mean, it depends a little bit on what tradition you're working off within the Christian family of traditions. But the methods that I learned distinguish between meditation and contemplation. So meditation are preparatory exercises. You do visualizations, spoken words, formal prayer that you do to kind of let go and prepare yourself for contemplation. Contemplation, it takes place after you've been able to let go and this sensation overwhelms you. And it actually is kind of technique less. That's why it's very difficult to talk about it, I think, for a lot of theologians, especially in the literature, because you're then in the realm of you're not supposed to have any words anyway, because you're in this sensation. But yet there are what the contemplative studies people call the micro gestures of contemplation. And I say that the micro gestures of contemplation are actually to do with release and relaxation. And so for me, one of the ways of getting into contemplation quickly is to take some deep breaths. I know that sounds really, really banal, but deep breaths that are the kind of releasing like breaths where you just let go of everything. That can springboard you into contemplative states much quicker than a prayer can, although you can also use prayer in combination with breath. And another micro gesture is to speak from the heart, so that the words are not formal, where you're trying to sort of let go of the mind's activity as well. And speaking from the heart is one way of doing that. And it doesn't even have to be even real words, like it can sort of be nonsense. It doesn't matter. So those are the micro gestures of contemplation. I hope that. And it's much easier to do in the forest, for instance. And I find it interesting that a lot of the traditional Christian texts say that, you know, ideally you do this like in the desert, in the wilderness, etc., etc. And yes, you can do it in your cell, but actually it's not. The cell is supposed to imitate the wilderness, not the other way around. And that's often lost, I think, today when we think about the cell and the contemplative. But in fact, the cell is a sort of, if you can't be outside, then recreate a kind of stark environment inside. So.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you both. Okay, the Owens Valley. Let's have a little wander through the Owens Valley. I mean, thanks for the question. I could say it's when you wander up out of the valley floor and into the White Mountains and find yourself in the presence of the bristlecone pines. I think the most ancient trees in the world, or among the most ancient, completely unexpected and not majestic like the redwoods or the sequoias, but just so moving. I could talk about climbing from the desert floor up through Big Creek Canyon. You can go in a day's hike. This is one of the remarkable things about the Owens Valley. It's an ecotone. You're in the desert and you're in very close proximity to the high country, and you can climb out of the desert and up to lakes at 10,000 feet through a long, hard day's climbing, and you're having this experience of moving through so many different distinct habitats. I could talk about the delight of encountering Mary Austin's house in Independence, still standing. Anybody who's ever made a pilgrimage to honor a beloved writer or teacher can know that feeling. And maybe the last word I'll say is that, the places that we are hoping to learn to love in a better way, or not love into extermination, love more gently, more fully, more wholeheartedly. These are also places that have complicated histories often. And the Owens Valley happens to be the site of Manzanar, one of the Japanese internment camps or concentration camps where Japanese Americans were rounded up in World War II and held against their will. And that place has become a site of memory for many people, not just Japanese Americans, but there's a Manzanar pilgrimage every year. And people from so many different parts of California and beyond gather at Manzanar as a gesture of solidarity against forgetting what happened there, and also in the hopes of learning to live in the place differently than we have done in the past. So those are some of the places I would say that have moved me in the Owens Valley.
Thank you. And aside from the big lake up high, I have embraced experiences both in the White Mountains and at Manzanar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for those wonderful questions. We have a question here from Michael Wexler, thinking with Emerson about how to live with solitude with other people. Can this be done? Or perhaps we might say, how might this be done? How do we live with the insight or inflaming or interiority that comes more easily with solitude while in community with others, be they other human beings, other elements, the forces of distraction, however we might take that. I'm struck in thinking about this, about a really interesting shift that happens within the Jewish mystical tradition in between the 13th and the 18th centuries. In the 13th century, when Nachmanides comments on the biblical injunction to cleave to God in the book of Deuteronomy, to connect oneself to God, to become attached to the divine. So Nachmanides, the great biblical commentator, the great Kabbalist, the great jurist, great poet, jack of all trades and master of them all, he 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 notes, citing Yehuda Halevi in the generations before him, that it's possible to connect with God even when you're surrounded by other people, as long as your mind's eye is trained on the divine. Your heart is no longer with the others around you, and it can keep this kind of contemplative posture. And you allow this is my word, not his, but you allow the distractions to wash over you, but they don't move you because you're intimately intertwined with the divine. And so that solitude is kept, which is great and beautiful and powerful, and also in some ways, when I read sources like that, quite heartbreaking because of the kind of perhaps ethical orientation or just the affect of moving through the world. The words that he uses there are more or less libo eno emo, that your heart is not with your fellow, your other. And obviously, he's not thinking in Heideggerian terms, but this kind of almost contemplative solipsism is something that we, standing in the 20th century, have seen the problems with it, be they interpersonal, be they social, or be they environmental. And that's why, in some respects, I'm drawn to the 18th century sources of Hasidism, which say, if you wish to hear the voice of God, you attune yourself to the voice of human beings around you. If you wish to see divine revelation, you open your mind's eye not only to that which transpires within the self, but to the remarkable and vibrant landscape around you. And the voice of revelation, the sound of revelation, the sight of revelation, the world becomes critical for those things. And thinking with that, it would mean that every species that's extinguished is a destruction of one part of the divine voice. Elements that are destroyed are the destruction of the possibilities of revelation. Here I'm thinking also with Vine Deloria's critique of conservationism and our understanding of sacred spaces. And one of the things that he points out there is that, sacred spaces are not only those which have been hallowed or rendered sacred in the past, but if we don't have places for future awakening, for the future possibilities of revelation, then who knows how many visions of Sinai we have plowed under? Who knows how many infinite potentials have been fracked? Here I'm also thinking with David Seidenberg's wonderful work on the more than human world in the Kabbalistic tradition, and the way in which our world really reverberates with this kind of divine imagery, and the way that human beings are necessarily a part of that.
Can I just add something to that? Yeah, I was thank you so much. I was thinking along the same lines, and how my own experience of contemplation was that reading the texts, you think it's about turning inwards. There's all this emphasis on going inwards in the Western Christian tradition. And it's almost unbearable, actually, trying to gather up the courage to do so, to practice it today, especially if, you've read a lot of feminism and you have an hypercritical theory. Like, why would you do this thing? It's just like a celebration of your inner self and things. But when I tried doing it, what I found was that the actual contemplative experience, like this sensation called the pleasure and the enjoyment and all these wonderful things which make the practice worth doing again, they actually come only when you've left yourself, right? And they are amplified when you're not actually in yourself. And the texts all talk about how it's actually the ability to do this in the presence of others, in society, in the kind of world of other beings, right? Like that's when it grows. But that's part of the tradition that is constantly left out of the narrative, I think. We have this fascination today of like the Lone Ranger type contemplative, right? I think it just means that the idea of contemplative ecology, I think to some can seem really contradictory, actually, because isn't contemplation about, you know, just like going out on your own and leaving the world behind, and et cetera, et cetera. And there are aspects of like, there's a movement of contraction, like efflux and, you know, that it's flux and efflux. But at the same time, I think we always lose sight of that part of the narrative, the way in which the contemplative experience grows actually in with other seedlings and beings and so on.
I also want to say something. I appreciate this question so much, and I appreciate so much what both Ariel and Simone have said. I'm like getting very tired of solitude as an expectation for contemplation, right? In the same way that Simone just mentioned, this kind of Lone Ranger stereotype that we have of contemplatives. And so it became very interesting to me to seek out, and some of the things that drive my research actually are seeking out the places in Buddhist contemplative literature where there's like these really practical conversations about like how to heal an illness, how to appropriately like deal with like people you don't like, you know, like these kinds of things that I think, and they're happening within the context of contemplative practice, right? Not only that, but also contemplation in the context, you know, these meditation practices that I was talking about. But not only these meditation practices are always like very discursive in the sense that it's like, or dialogical in the sense that you're like, you're in conversation with Buddhas and deities, and there's such a deep sense of kind of social embeddedness in a social reality that includes human beings, some whom you like and some who you don't like, and which is sort of part of like our reality, and also like more than human beings, some of whom are your allies and some of whom are not, you know. And that interests me like so much, actually. I'm really deeply interested and curious about how to be in the world. But anyway, that cheeky answer of I'm tired of solitude was in no way a reflection on your wonderful question, Michael. So thank you. Yeah.
Oh, maybe just to be a little contrarian here. I mean, I guess part of what makes it interesting and important to talk about these things with one another is precisely this sense of how we sometimes veer off strongly in this direction or in that direction. And veering off can be a site of discovery as well. We need to veer off. We need to go far in one direction or another. And then sometimes in our zeal, we need a little course correction. We need to be brought back in this way or that. So if you're sick of solitude, Devin, I don't blame you, you know, and it's like you can become sick of spirituality too. If one more person talks about spiritual growth and development, you know, I'm going to scream when what you want is some kind of basic human thriving and joy with others and care for the and so forth. But I guess I want to say something about I mean it's partly my own experience, but it's partly you know, working with young people who continue to kind of wander into my presence and some of the classes that I teach, especially in the desert, on a course on the desert I've been teaching with a colleague of mine for many years. And we work hard to create a communal space and a space of belonging, and that's critical to everything that happens. But something else I notice is that it's often a rare, if not completely absent experience for someone to be present to herself or himself in a simple way. And that doesn't require solitude necessarily, but often it requires some degree of stillness or solitude. And so then this kind of this, and again, this is not to speak against Simone or Devin necessarily, but inwardness in this sense is like it's allowing space to gather where you can encounter your own fragile beauty and perhaps through that recover a sense of your relationship with others that needed that space and silence and stillness to bloom a little bit. And solitude is not loneliness, although sometimes they're related. There's so much loneliness everywhere. And I do feel like solitude can be a door through which we walk to rediscover our own vibrant human belonging with others. But it sometimes requires a little bit of time alone or in silence or in stillness. And so and if I may be permitted, I'll just finish with this little. So I brought this little text along with me on my journey up to my daughter's wedding, of writer who I've come to just adore, Muso Soseki, and he says in one of his small little meditations, it's a little paean to solitude, I suppose. In this small hut are worlds beyond number. Living here alone, I have endless company. Already I have attained the essence. How could I dare want something higher? Living here alone, I have endless company. I don't think there's anybody in this gathering that would have anything other than admiration for that holism of feeling. So I guess I just want to say, I think we need to incorporate whatever language we use to get at it: solitude, stillness, silence. I think it's kind of in the spirit of some of what you said earlier too, Devin. Like these practices that allow us to go deep. So yeah, that's just my little offering.
So beautiful, Douglas. Thank you.
I think as a way of drawing this conversation to a close, um, I'm actually going to reserve the right of final word for something that I'd like to read to us from Ellen's most recent book. But before that, I'd like to ask each of you for one sentence as a blessing, as a hope, as a dream, as a possibility, as an invocation that you'd like to leave us with.
I can say something, which is just, yeah, sort of like a final word on this like little talk that I gave earlier is just to say that every moment of your awareness and attention is a sacred and precious resource.
We'll go in reverse order then, the presentation. My words are, I guess, also going back to my talk. But I wanted to somehow think with this idea of the reintegrating the solitude into the practice if there's a risk of it falling away. There's a practice of going inside the chambers of your heart and finding that there is a garden there. And from that garden to find that the world is in you and you are the world. And those are the moments that I find to be really exciting and exhilarating. And I think puts you at the nexus of the world and individuality where you can't really separate.
Well, perhaps I'll just add briefly the idea of it's kind of an exhortation, I think, from Meister Eckhart to learn to acquire an inward desert wherever and with whomever you are.
One of the things that Zoom does very badly is create spaces for song. One of the things that I think Zoom does really well is create spaces for silence because when it happens, it's so much more, even more repercussive than in person. And I want to thank each of our three panelists for everything that they have said and everything that they have left unsaid in those moments of repercussive silence. In 30 minutes, we're going to reconvene for the third and final panel of today's event in honor of Alan Bernstein. And with that, I'm going to close with just one or two lines that are actually the continuation of a passage that we looked at in the previous session. So Ellen wrote, hurrying about, focused on the daily tasks before us, we often overlook the beauty of the living world in our midst. We need to slow down long enough so that our senses can attune to the verdant world around us. The Song of Songs, teaches that if we are open to it, beauty can stop us in our tracks. It can draw us into a state of contemplation, or in Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's words, a state of radical amazement. It can arouse our curiosity, our appreciation, and our humility. The experience of beauty can strengthen our inner resources and our resolve to act on behalf of that which we love. Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Devin. And I look forward to seeing everyone in a half an hour.
Thank you.
Thank you.